Hello. Before I introduce the next speaker, I'd like to give two stories. The first one begins in 17th century Holland. Right outside a synagogue, the philosopher and scientist Baruch Spinoza came into contact with a knife-wielding assailant. The assailant ran up to him, shouted "heretic," took a few stabs, tore up Spinoza's robe, a robe which he kept for the rest of his life as a reminder of that encounter. Now, Spinoza's crime was heresy, as the assailant shouted, but mainly he disagreed with strict Jewish doctrine. He was himself a product of a very insular community, one that he challenged vigorously and was eventually exiled from. About 400 years later, in the same country of Holland, the filmmaker Theo van Gogh was also attacked by a knife-wielding assailant, and he was not so fortunate to survive. The assailant was mad. Theo van Gogh had directed a film with the Somali Dutch activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali, that was very critical of the way Islam treated women. In fact, in his right between the knife and Mr. Van Gogh's body was a note explaining the attacker's motives and, singling out Ayaan by name as well. The parallels between these two cases are clear. Something very dark was returning to Europe, the specter of religious fanaticism. And something else is returning to Europe at the same time, the active use of anti-blasphemy codes. Now, the issue of blasphemy is central to both of these cases. Both men had spoken out against beliefs cherished by many. Spinoza challenged the theology of his own community. He believed in an impersonal God, one that didn't legislate or command every part of human life. He had a lot of interesting other ideas you guys can look into. And Van Gogh insulted the religious sensibilities of his assassin. Now, originally, this sort of persecution of heresy was overcome during the Enlightenment by the heroic efforts of many people like Spinoza. Spinoza himself was central to that. In the words of Rebecca Goldstein, philosopher Rebecca Goldstein, he was the renegade Jew that gave us modernity. And he deserves that honor very well. Now, in both of these cases, the assailant was a private individual, someone acting on behalf of their own personal motivations. They were not a part of any structure or state or even a terrorist group. And such instances are horrific, to be sure, and should always be condemned. But I would argue they're not as troublesome as sort of persecution done by the state. Mainly because no matter how just you can have a society, it only takes one malicious actor to commit a heinous act like this. But more insidious, however, is state-sponsored persecution of blasphemy, as existed in the European Middle Ages. And those are the same codes that are making a comeback today. The next speaker, Shaan Taseer, will discuss blasphemy codes in Pakistan. But what we don't know is that there are a lot of blasphemy codes in Europe. A most recent case where an Austrian individual was criticizing the Prophet Muhammad, was fined by Austria and I think imprisoned. And the European Court on Human Rights said that this person's rights were not violated. There's an anti-blasphemy statute in Austria that signals out as punishment, imprisonment, and fines for offending religious sensibilities. In Germany, similar cases came about. One individual printed out a toilet paper inscribed with the words of the Quran and was later imprisoned. The motivation behind the readoption of blasphemy laws is not to promote a specific religion per se. Germany and Austria don't want to proselytize Islam. They're implemented as a way to, in their minds, to protect what they consider vulnerable communities. These anti-blasphemy laws are supposed to prohibit and stop in theory, unjust persecution, malicious actions against innocent members of a religious group. But I think that's wrong-headed. I think this is what happens when you're more concerned about protecting a group than you are about protecting the rights of the individuals in that group. It's not true that shielding any religious group from criticizing their religion, that this is a good thing for them. What happens instead is you end up freezing the sorts of injustices and iniquities that are in the community itself. Instead, we really have to amplify the voices of critics of such communities, including the brave organizers of this event, and everyone who's spoken today, as well as Mr. Shaan Taseer, who took up the mantle of criticizing blasphemy laws from his father, who was the former governor of Punjab and was assassinated for that work. And Mr. Taseer is continuing that brave work, and I'm happy to introduce him next.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I will try to bring to this conversation a perspective from another part of the world. And I will want to know from all of you if some of the underlying drivers and some of the underlying motivations that I speak of are familiar to you, because I do believe that religions operate in similar ways around the world. I will not just speak about the blasphemy law, but about religious laws generally. Now, religions claim infallibility right off the bat. So they are therefore not a good moral compass to guide lawmaking, because a law cannot ever be infallible. Now, in a world full of so many unimaginable horrors, our rights, our entitlement to be protected from the cruelty of others. And we have certain rights simply on account of being human. They are innate, they are inalienable, they are universal, they are available to everyone on this planet. Not to any belief system, not to any particular denomination. And most importantly, this entitlement is not incidental to another narrative, to an origin myth. It's the central story of a post-Enlightenment world. Now, religions too grant a form of rights. They are not the kind of rights you would recognize with your entitlement goggles on. They are more resembling of laws, things you can and cannot do. The closest thing to inalienable and universal rights that you will find within religions are generally reserved for the religion itself. The first article of Islam, the Kalma, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah. What greater right can there be, ladies and gentlemen, than the right to be worshipped, to be revered, not just worshipped, but worshipped exclusively. And this is not a right limited to the spiritual realm. It has very immediate earthly consequences, because implied with a right to be worshipped is, of course, as we know, infallibility, and therefore a right to not be criticized. That's God. What about human beings? Like I said, there are rights, there are codes that can broadly maintain a system of social justice, retributive justice based broadly on a tit-for-tat mechanism. In Islam, for example, the Quran allows blood money in compensation for murder, payable to the relatives of a victim. It also enjoins them to simply forgive. I would like you to think about that for a minute. A person other than the victim of murder has the ability to simply forgive the murderer, take away the crime. Obviously, there's nothing innate in such a law. In fact, such a law would not see society as a collection of individuals. It sees society as a collection of families or a collection of tribes. And I can concede that this would maintain social order at some point in time, because it would, and so the justification goes, it would prevent endless tribal warfare. But what happens, how does it play out today? What if you stress test it a little bit? What about cases of murders in families, such as infanticide? In 2012, a famous Saudi cleric raped and murdered his 5-year-old daughter because he suspected her of being a non-virgin, 5-year-old. A death sentence was reduced to 3 years in jail because he paid the girl's mother, his ex-wife, a handsome compensation. Now, I would ask everyone in this room, which of you, if you were present at the bedside of 5-year-old Lama Al-Kamdi, the victim's name, as she lay there dying 4 months later, succumbing to her injuries, which of you would actually want to hold her hand and say, don't worry, little Lama, justice will be done, we have your back, you will receive justice, which will involve the exchange of a substantial amount of money. Which of you would make these words of consolation? In other words, what I'm trying to get at is, how can a law that claims infallibility get it so disastrously wrong? When such overwhelmingly supreme rights are given to a deity, the right to have humanity worship you, then God's rights will crowd out human rights. And when the glorification of God becomes the primary objective around which society is organized, human well-being will take second place. In northern Pakistan, my home country, a month ago there were news stories of schoolgirls being harassed. And how does the chief minister of the province respond? He makes the abaya, essentially a form of clothing, covering. He makes the abaya mandatory for schoolgirls, essentially signaling that a schoolgirl is an object of lust, and the only way to prevent the sin is to cover up the temptation. Mercifully, this idiotic ruling was revoked because of a storm from civil society. But the key point that I'm getting at to note over here is that when a society's problem-solving mechanism becomes religion as opposed to reason, human beings will suffer. Their rights will be compromised because policy is not drafted with them in mind, it is drafted with God in mind. There is a desire for obscurantism in many parts of the world today, but especially in poorer parts of the world, among people who feel that they have been left out from the great march of history. And it's justified by something which I'd call the argument from mythology, essentially the golden age fallacy. And it goes something like this, that in the past there was a golden age, a time of great worldly power and influence and justice and prosperity. In the case of Islam, these are the early years of Islam, where an empire was forged at lightning speed within a generation, rivaling Rome, rivaling Persia. I believe, and I wouldn't want to talk in detail about other religions I do not have a lived experience of, but there are talks of golden ages in Judaism, the time of King David, in Christianity, the second coming. But crucially, the crucial ingredient in the golden age fallacy is that the reason for worldly success is never ascribed to a set of economic and social policies which will improve conditions through cause and effect. Things that you can test, you can demonstrate, perhaps recreate. No. Worldly success is ascribed only and only to the grace of God in return for obeying His will. God essentially grants empire. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, currently Mr. Imran Khan, calls his economic policies by the name of the first Islamic state. He calls it the Riyasat-e-Madina. So essentially he is claiming that through his reforms, he is going to recreate a 7th century Islamic state. great symbolic messaging to his religious followers, but there's no attempt to demonstrate how a particular set of policies will recreate a 7th century state, nor even whether that particular 7th century state is the best on offer that we have today, or the best we can or should hope for, that a poor country, a developing nation should hope for with respect to unemployment, life expectancy, access to education, medical care, social services. Are there not better examples on offer? But no. In the Golden Age fallacy, we ignore empiricism and take refuge essentially in historical thumb-sucking. And in Pakistan, for example, in the debate on blasphemy, which rages on the airwaves, rages on social media, I have never, and I'm fairly sort of steeped in that debate. I have never till today heard a single argument for the blasphemy law that is based on human compassion. The debate centers on one issue only, that is this divine command theory. Does the Holy Book call for blasphemy or not? And that's where the argument ends. There's no attempt by advocates to formulate an argument based on compassion. And that is what is wrong with divine command theory. It trumps human compassion. And that is a travesty. When the primary goal of a society becomes the resurrection of the past, then such a society looks backward. Again, an example from my country. In the 1980s, we had an Islamic military dictator, General Zia, and we had severe power shortages. Now, when a country is facing power shortages, you might expect, say, a national power policy, more power stations, harnessing solar, wind power, cost-benefit analyses, budgets. In the 1980s, in a poor country like Pakistan, actual money and actual resources were put into a project to create electricity by harnessing the power of jinns. Jinns as in genies, like, Casper. Or, as Wendy told us earlier today, we have judges of the Supreme Court who claim to be able to speak to and have verdicts dictated to them by unborn fetuses. To invoke a religious solution in national policy is a form of the Golden Age fallacy. It's a pessimistic view of history because it's saying that the best is behind us. It's saying that we cannot improve, and our greatest achievements as a species are due primarily to God's benevolence, not to human ingenuity. Of course, the greatest prize for religious obscurantism in the world today goes to the Saudi Grand Mufti. The reason I mention his name is because of the influence that the Saudi Grand Mufti carries throughout the Muslim world, including in my country. In Saudi Arabia, his proclamations, which are called fatwas, hold the power of law. According to the Saudi Grand Mufti, the world is flat. And if you disagree with him, you can be killed. He believes that the moon landing was a hoax. He believes that chess is haram, as in forbidden. He believes that he's proclaimed that Mickey Mouse is haram. Mickey Mouse is the agent of the devil. And he also believes that obeying the Crown Prince Salman bin Muhammad is a duty upon all believers. So if ever you saw a handmaiden to absolute power, dictatorship, monarchies, it is organized religion and religious law. Because when your mind believes that there is a higher truth, that you are in possession of, to the exclusion of the rest of the world, a truth so profound that it determines whether you are worthy of an eternity in bliss or an eternity of torment, essentially conscious experiences at opposite ends of the spectrum, then after that, it's not possible for your worldview to be humanistic. Your worldview becomes dualistic, almost by definition. There's an us, there's a them, ends justify the means, and laws fashioned out of this thinking are inimical to human rights, equality, solidarity, brotherhood. The right to not be infallible, the right to not be questioned, creates another job opening for a moral police force to enforce that right. And enter the blasphemy laws. That's where the blasphemy laws come in, to enforce the infallibility of the divine. A blasphemy law essentially provides human rights to an idea. A right to life, a right to live in dignity, a right to not be molested, to an idea. And my country, Pakistan, has the dubious honor of having the single harshest law in existence in the world today, in any nation state. I say nation state because I exclude monarchies like Saudi Arabia. It's called Article 295C, and it's commonly known as the blasphemy law. And it goes something like this. A derogatory remark, action, utterance, inference, imputation, I'm not making this up, insinuation, direct, indirect, intended, unintended, against the Prophet Muhammad is punishable by death. You will notice how vague, how broad, how undefined the crime is. It's anything anyone wants it to be. It's a sword of Damocles. And notice also that for a crime so broad and so undefined, the punishment is so absolute, death. You may have heard of Blackstone's ratio, a founding legal principle. It's better that 10 guilty persons escape than one innocent suffer. Such a law is essentially saying that when a life is at stake, the highest standard of evidence is required to prove a crime. The blasphemy law turns the Blackstone principle on its head. It basically says that the rights of an idea, of a deity, of a prophet is infinitely higher than a human being's right to the presumption of innocence. And when you leave a law undefined, then over time, its definition becomes broader and broader and broader. My father was accused of blasphemy and murdered by religious groups in 2011. He was criticized for blasphemy, he was accused of blasphemy for criticizing the blasphemy law. Please notice what a curious thing this is. The blasphemy law is possibly, and I would say to an extent this applies to all religious laws, they are the only laws that can invoke themselves to justify themselves. So a blasphemy law is great. If you disagree, that's blasphemy. It's essentially hermetically sealed. That's how the argument goes. That's how it survives. This is a travesty. It is attested by 200 innocent prisoners of the blasphemy law in jail in Pakistan today, without the right to fair trial, without the presumption of innocence, without the right to a lawyer, without the right to impartial judiciary, without the right to bail, without the right to trial in a reasonable amount of time, without the right to humane treatment under the law. If this is not a collision of rights and religions, ladies and gentlemen, what is? It, I believe, is also an affront to our deepest dignity as human beings. And most importantly, I want to talk, and this is the most important part of my talk, is where you all come in. There is a tendency at times, and I can understand it, when you hear of issues of religious persecution, to write them off as something that belongs to that part of the world, and to write the entire society off, and to tarnish the entire society with one big broad brush. That is essentially to ignore very deep and long-standing traditions of liberal thought that exist essentially in all parts of the world. And the kinds of societies we are talking about are societies in conflict. Where there's bigotry, where there's all these horrible laws, there's also a very robust civil society, humanists, writers, poets, ordinary folks. And most importantly, there are those who suffer and those who fight under the blasphemy law. Men, women, children, the elderly, the infirm, mentally, physically challenged, the peasants, shopkeepers, sweepers, gutter cleaners, the poorest of the poor. It's a humanitarian emergency. Where prisoners exist without trial, it is not a problem that belongs to one country or one religion. It becomes an issue for humanity. Like apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s wasn't an issue just for South Africa to deal with. It was a human issue. Because it should have shaken everyone's, and I'm sure it did, every conscientious person's humanity to the core. So what I wanted to say was, get involved. Throw your lot in. Don't be saviors, be allies. If you believe in a world without religious discrimination, the people fighting the blasphemy law in Pakistan are on the front line of that fight and are essentially creating a world that hopefully your grandchildren will inhabit, a world without religious persecution. Join their fight. They need you as much as you need them. Thank you. Any questions? Disagreements? Sorry, I think, will someone walk around? Will pass you a mic or?
Hello.
I'll let
Hi.
him decide. No, I'll let him decide.
This gathering has an example that the blasphemy law brought up. People with different agendas, different members of different groups have come together for a common purpose. That's happening in the U.S. House of Representatives right now. There's a congressman named Jamie Raskin, who's a Democrat, and a congressman named Mark Meadows, who's a Republican. Jamie is thought of as a liberal. Mark Meadows is head of the Freedom Party. He's a Republican. And they have a resolution that they're offering which may someday reach the floor, that condemns blasphemy, both here in America and overseas. Blasphemy laws. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. That was the head of the American Atheist that just pointed out my error. But what's interesting about it is they're doing it for different communities and different reasons. Mark Meadows is a very religious Christian. Jamie generally considers himself a humanist Jew. They're both protecting their communities with good law, or good resolution. I wish it were a law. That's what this group is. Good for you guys for being here. We've got a future.
Thank you for that really, really stimulating and enlightening talk. I have a very simple question. You admonished us at the end to join this fight against blasphemism. How would you propose that we do that, we as individuals?
Write to your member of parliament, your congressman, ask him to bring it up in the Congress. Write to the Pakistani High Commissioner. Write to your representative in the United Nations, create awareness, financially support one family that's been accused of blasphemy. If someone is accused of blasphemy, the entire family becomes economically ostracized. Their sources of income dry up. Write a letter to a prisoner of blasphemy, publish it on social media. Show him that someone from the other end of the world cares. Come together, meet, brainstorm, make the issue mainstream.
Is there a website that we could consult that would...
You can try you can use my website. It's called pakistanforall.com.
Repeat that, please.
Pakistanforall, one word, .com. Or follow me on Twitter. and we
Okay,
can
thank
have
you.
that
Thanks
conversation.
very much.
First of all, thank you so much, Shaan, you and your whole family, for everything that you've done, because, I mean, it's easy for us to speak out, but for somebody in Pakistan to speak out, it actually means, risking their lives. So it's hard for us to kind of conceive of that. Here's one thing I have a little bit of trouble with, I grew up in Pakistan. Well, I know a lot more about Pakistan than most people. So I know like the image people have of it mostly, villagers and uneducated people, and that's wrong. I mean, I know lots of people that are like lawyers in the Supreme Court, like really intellectual people,
Yeah.
really intelligent people, and yet there hasn't been, like most of the people, for example, in Congress or Parliament, have not been able to overturn this law. There hasn't been anything against it. All these people, these 200, you're saying 200 people
Officially
accused.
reported 200, unofficially probably 10 times the number.
I mean, I'm not going to even try to think about that, but yeah, so the official 200 people that are just basically rotting in jail, people of like having like lawyers don't want to represent them, they're not given any of their rights. So, I can see that part of it definitely has to be that people are afraid to risk their own lives, right? But, when there were the protests against Asya, when Asya Bibi was found guilty and there was all these protests in the streets, Imran Khan could have very easily, sent the military in and said, to heck with you, I'm going to put all of you in jail. And he didn't. He compromised with the mullahs. And so my question to you is, why do you think that is? Do they really have that much power, or is there amongst the intellectuals in Pakistan, the moderates in Pakistan, some actual fear that if they don't give in to them, that their religious, their religion is come into question somehow?
Or their lives, they lose their lives. It's not just their religions coming into question. There's no doubt about that. The most powerful person in the country, the chief of army staff in Pakistan, is afraid when the religious groups call for the head. There's absolutely no doubt about the fact that that if you speak out against blasphemy, the flip side to that is that you'll be killed. Which is why I say that we should not leave it to governments. The onus is on us as individuals to see the fight is being fought for you by Nabil Masih, by Junaid Hafiz, and the other 200 in jail. They are fighting legal cases. They are there at the front line. We should support them. And there's certain things that people can do that governments can't. We can hold events like this. We can write, for example, last year some people got together and did a letter writing campaign. Junaid Hafiz was flooded with letters. Then there was send him a book. This guy, Junaid Hafiz, by the way, he's the poster boy of this horrible law right now. He's an ex-Fulbright scholar, brilliant man. He was pulled down by his academic rivals and accused of blasphemy. Avid reader. So there was sort of people got together and to send him a book. He reads a book a day. And he can communicate. He sent a list of his favorite books and what he wants. And people from around the country sent him books. Now, the mullahs did not take objection to this, surprisingly. So there's certain things that get them sort of press their buttons. But raising awareness in different ways that we can is probably, in the long run, more beneficial. It's public embarrassment that ended apartheid. It wasn't militaries and regimes, and it was embarrassing for South Africa after a while. And the only people who can shift the curve to make the cost of that high is people like us. But the crucial point I want to make is that don't think of yourselves as Americans or New Yorkers. This is a human issue. It shouldn't be contained within a geography or a boundary. It's an issue that should affect everyone over here. And it's people like you who should take an issue like this on.
All right, this concludes our program of the day. Thank you all so much for being here today, making this a huge success. How are you all feeling? Good. So I just wanted to do a couple housekeeping things for those who are at the hotel. There's a 7 p.m. shuttle that this would be for the speakers. If you haven't filled out a survey, please do that. We would appreciate that. If you'd like to know when our next conference is, if there is one, sign up for our mailing list and give us lots of money too, please. And we will need to clear out at 6:30, so you're welcome to hang and have conversations, but we'll start needing to move you out at 6:30. And last but not least, the Amish before at 6. Okay, so 6 o'clock. And then last but not least, the Amish Heritage Foundation's second annual conference is next month, Saturday, November 16. Would love it if you came. The topic is overturning Wisconsin v. Yoder, making education a federal right for all children. So it affects everyone. It's not just about the Amish. Most people don't know that the federal courts in the US don't even recognize that children or any citizen has a right to an education. So you can learn all about that there. And I think Malky wants to say something.
Yeah. I just want to close us all out by thanking you all for participating in this incredible day of discussion. I also want to just say that this has been such a meaningful experience working with these two incredible leaders, Sarah and Tora. We've had a year together, and it's been quite remarkable. And I think what could be, I think a nice way to end this is to talk about an exchange I had. Sarah had this great idea as we were talking about this event to have an Ask Me Anything, I learned about social media, on an AMA on Reddit. And I had this really interesting exchange with someone. I don't know who, right? For you, Malky Schwartz, I grew up as a Muslim in a heavily anti-Semitic Arab household. Do Orthodox Jewish households hold the same sentiment? And how do ex-Jews and ex-Muslims interact? My response, I appreciate that you talked about your particular household and asked about mine. I had hoped she did, or he. Because it is impossible for us to accurately generalize about what takes place in households throughout our communities. I believe that othering, drawing clear lines between us and them, is practiced too frequently and often has negative consequences for our world. I hope that at our conference we can talk about othering, whether and how insularity plays a role in othering, and how we can advance greater understanding. Can there be a special role for ex-Muslims and ex-ultra-Orthodox Jews to play in fostering understanding among our communities of origin and beyond? I pose that as a question I will consider. I don't claim to have answers, definitely not answers that will apply to all people from all insular religious communities. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.